drab ship follows a convoy of merchant vessels as they're battered about by the grey Atlantic. For days, it's been the same old routine. Watch after endless watch, blurring the line where sky and sea meet. But then, suddenly, a shout. A wisp of smoke on the horizon. The captain stares unbelieving through his binoculars. There, in plain view, is a modern, fast German warship, barreling right for him. But the vessel under his command isn't really a warship. She's an ocean liner, kitted out as a merchant cruiser with an optimistic handful of guns. The skipper knows that to run is futile. His ship can be outpaced by the Germans with ease, but worst of all, the convoy will be mercilessly hunted down and destroyed. He and his crew will have to make a stand, and the ultimate sacrifice. He shouts his orders, the wheel is swung and the vessel heels round to face the might and the fury of a 15,000-ton German heavy cruiser. This is the reality in which Captain Edward Fegan and the men of the liner Jervis Bay found themselves in late 1940. It's one of the greatest tales of sacrifice at sea, but it's not an isolated incident. The previous year, Rawalpindi, the venerable old P&O liner, had shaped up to the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Warship Designs, and these are the stories of the ships that fought back. November 1939. War has engulfed Europe, but it's not yet a world war. France, Britain and their allies stand against Nazi Germany. The month prior, the final resistance in Poland surrendered and the country fell. At sea, Britain's mighty navy found itself pitted against an impressive foe. For years, Nazi Germany had been secretly rearming, with the Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, fudging tonnage and weapons numbers to get around limitations imposed by the Versailles and Washington naval treaties. In the end, Hitler gave up even trying to hide his objectives, constructing and launching massive modern battleships like Bismarck and Tirpitz. In 1939 and early 1940, Britain and their allies were losing dozens and dozens of ships. The real secret to the Kriegsmarine's success early on was its submarine fleet. U-boats began to hunt and destroy Allied shipping by their dozens. In fact, those early months of the war would be fondly remembered by U-boat crews as the happy times. Countermeasures were few and underdeveloped. Submarines could hunt in groups called wolf packs and destroy Allied convoys. But the convoys were vital. Britain was making a stand against Nazi Germany, but it is a relatively small island, not enormously rich in natural resources that were required to keep the war effort moving ahead. The nation relied on imports for food, resources and materiel from far-flung places like Canada, Australia and the United States. The issue was that the crucial ships and their goods were being sunk at an alarming rate. The merchant ships and convoys needed escorts to protect them, but there were only so many cruisers and destroyers to go around. And many of those were now needed to defend France and even Britain itself from a possible German attack. Instead, the British Admiralty had to get creative, and they looked to the civilian passenger line companies for the answer. Sitting at anchor or moored in ports across Britain and the Commonwealth were ocean liners, vast passenger ships designed to maintain regular passenger services in peacetime. With the outbreak of the war, their services were stopped, leaving them without a job. The Admiralty had different ideas for them. The concept of the Armed Merchant Cruiser, or AMC, was a bit of a stopgap one. The Admiralty could take an ocean liner, outfit it with deck guns, and then press it into service as a basic kind of escort ship for convoys. It actually had some merits. The ships were mostly already crewed by Royal Navy Reserve officers and crew with relevant training and skills, but ocean liners had been designed to be fast in order to stay competitive on their respective routes, so in a pinch, they should be able to outrun most danger. But more importantly, at that dire hour, they were plentiful. The British Merchant Navy was one of the largest in the world. It would be cheap and easy to take a selection of liners and convert them into AMCs. But of course, there were also massive drawbacks. Ocean liners are designed and built very differently to warships. They cannot sustain much damage. They're just not intended for torpedo hits or gunfights. They have tall silhouettes with towering funnels and superstructures that rise up high out of the water, making them a juicy, easy target. Deck guns were small, and they often relied on local targeting and range finding, so it depended entirely on the skill of the gun crew to manage any hits. But by contrast, warships like battleships or cruisers featured complex rangefinders that could train their massive guns using early computers to calculate ideal targeting information and generate accurate hits. And even worse, AMCs were essentially useless against submarines. They might deter a U-boat from trying to attack on the surface, but once the submarine was submerged, an AMC lacked the agility and speed to be able to run it down and attack with depth charges. Right away, some of the biggest players in the peacetime merchant world had their ships called up for service, and one of those was the famous line P&O. The Peninsula and Oriental Steam Navigation Company was a massive organisation that had hundreds of ships operating from Britain to the Mediterranean, India, the Far East, and Australia. Unlike predominantly transatlantic companies like Cunard White Star Line, P&O's ships were designed specifically to maintain extremely far-ranging services. Now, the range of their ships was critical because it meant if they were converted to use as AMCs, they could go a long time without needing refueling. And one of the first P&O liners called up for service was the HMS Rawalpindi, and it would prove to be a fateful decision that would end up pitting the valiant little ocean liner against two of the most ferocious warships in the North Atlantic. Rawalpindi, by 1939, was like a ship from a different world. She'd been built by the famous shipyard Harland and Wolff in Belfast in 1925 for service from Britain to Bombay. In the 1920s, P&O was in a bit of a strange place. They were building ships in the tradition and styles of the Edwardian era. The interiors featured heavy, dark wooden panelling and stuffy smoking rooms. The thing is, that era was long dead by then, and the company had begun to realise it. In the late 1920s, they began to plan and build a new group of ships that would bring their fleet into the modern age, but back in 1925, they were still making them like they always had. Even when she was new, Rawalpindi just looked old. She had been built to P&O's long-standing traditional aesthetic, two tall black funnels you'd have seen on ships just like her some 30 or 40 years earlier. Her superstructure was painted a brownish colour like the rest of the fleet instead of the usual brilliant white you'd expect to find on other ships. She was the second of four sisters, known as the R-Class. The interiors of the ships were tasteful and restrained. They were actually designed by the daughter of P&O's chairman. The four R-Class ships were utilitarian, but comfortable for their passengers who'd sail to India for weeks-long voyages. On August 26, 1939, a month before the outbreak of the war, the Admiralty feared they'd soon have a need for a stopgap fleet of armed merchant cruisers. Rawalpindi was called up. She would be converted to go to war. To highlight just how stopgap this conversion was, you only need to look at the ship's armament. Rawalpindi was given 8 BL 6-inch 150mm guns, which had first gone to sea in 1899. By the Second World War, the elderly guns weren't seen as fit for frontline service, so reserves were handed out to AMCs and troop ships. To bolster her defences, she was given 3 12-pounder or 3-inch 76mm guns, which could also serve as anti-aircraft guns. So to make it easier to aim at aircraft and provide a wider arc of fire, the ship's second funnel, which was a dummy, was cut off, leaving Rawalpindi with a funny kind of unbalanced silhouette. Rawalpindi was put to Navy work after the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, under the command of 60-year-old Captain Edward Coverley Kennedy. He'd been on the retired list from Royal Navy service for 18 years, but before that he'd commanded no less than a battlecruiser and 2 light cruisers. After almost 2 decades behind a desk, he was thrilled to be back at sea. He said to one friend that I am as content as it is possible to be, and to another one he said, "They've given me some fine guns, and in this war, I'm going to use them." They would soon turn out to be prophetic words. Under his command was a crew of 276 men, many of whom had been Rawalpindi's peacetime crew. One old man was a Navy reservist who'd been a gunner aboard HMS Malaya at the Battle of Jutland some 23 years earlier. With a captain keen to serve his country and a well-trained crew, Rawalpindi set off on her first assignments. AMCs weren't just useful for escorting convoys. They could also help blockade Germany to ensure the country's powerful warships couldn't escape into the open Atlantic to hunt the British and Allied merchant ships. Rawalpindi, with her World War I vintage guns, wouldn't be expected to engage a German warship if she spotted one. Instead, she'd have to radio the position and tail the warship while the battle fleet steamed out to engage and destroy the enemy. On the afternoon of November 23rd, 1939, Rawalpindi was patrolling the Grey Seas north of the Faroe Islands. Now, this was prime location for an attempted German breakout. Even worse, it was known that the German pocket battleship Deutschland was actually on the loose somewhere out there in the Atlantic Ocean. Kennedy had actually been told to keep an eye out for her. The ship rolled in the waves, and the wind blew cold as men's eyes strained to keep lookout, and then, from the crow's nest, came a call. Oily black smoke was spotted on the horizon at 3:30 p.m, and Kennedy caught sight of the ship in his binoculars. Slowly it came into view, and then Kennedy muttered, "It's the Deutschland, all right." He ordered his crew to action stations, and the enemy ship's position was reported quickly by the radioman. He knew the simple math in his mind. Rawalpindi's top speed was 15 knots, and Deutschland and other German ships like her could do twice that. The German ship flashed a Morse signal, heave to, but Kennedy decided he'd try to turn away, first for a fog bank developing nearby, and then the shelter of a large iceberg. But it was too late. The German ship was gaining quickly, but then there was another cry from the lookout. A second ship had been spotted. Kennedy and his crew hoped it was a friendly cruiser arriving to help, but it wasn't. Nor was the first ship the cruiser Deutschland. Rawalpindi had accidentally stumbled into two of the largest, fastest German battleships afloat, Scharnhorst and her sister ship, the Gneisenau. The ships had been built in the mid-1930s, part of Hitler's ramped-up military rearmament strategy. In an attempt to comply at face value with post-World War I limitations and a subsequent agreement with Great Britain, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, the ships had fielded relatively small caliber main guns as their armament, 9 28cm or 11-inch guns and triple turrets. They were extremely nimble with low, slim silhouettes. With 3 turbines and screws and fine lines, the warships could hit 31 knots. They were extremely intimidating for British merchant sailors. The sisters' main caliber smaller guns wouldn't be very effective against well-protected British battleships, but they were ideal for picking apart merchant ships in convoys. The smaller caliber shells were less at risk of passing straight through the shell plating of a freighter's hull, and they could achieve a higher rate of fire. Rawalpindi now found itself in a fight against 2 of Nazi Germany's most ferocious warships, and all she had to hit back at them were 8 relatively small guns from the First World War. Kennedy made full steam for the shelter of the fog, and then the iceberg, hoping to obscure his escape with smoke floats. The ship dropped them, but they failed to ignite on the surface, and Scharnhorst and Gneisenau watched on as the British ship tried to escape. The Germans had so far held their fire. Scharnhorst's skipper, Kurt Caesar Hoffmann, had his crew signalled to Rawalpindi to abandon their ship and surrender, but Kennedy had other plans. With his ship caught in a trap from which there could be no escape, he decided to make a stand. He ordered the helm turned, and Rawalpindi was going to fight. Hoffmann ordered Rawalpindi to surrender again and again, and by this point the ships had closed to just 4 miles or 6.5 kilometers, which is almost point blank as far as naval combat goes. Then, to his amazement, Rawalpindi's guns suddenly burst into life. Kennedy had greeted his chief engineer on the bridge and told him his plan, said simply, "We'll fight them both, they'll sink us, and that will be that. Goodbye." Then he had ordered a salvo and his gunners got to work. Their aim was impressively accurate. The first salvo straddled Gneisenau and the second salvo hurtled towards Scharnhorst. They even scored a hit. But the effect of Rawalpindi's 6-inch guns against the heavy armour of the German warships was like that of a bow and arrow against the lightning. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau's turrets responded, and their effect was deadly. 11-inch shells raked Rawalpindi from stem to stern. The first German salvo hit the bridge directly and killed almost everybody in it. More shells silenced 6-inch gun turrets along the ship's side, smashed through the hull, and exploded in the engine room. The beautiful old liner was never designed for anything like this. She was meant to take excited passengers to exotic ports in India and the Middle East. Now she was being shelled by 2 of the most powerful and modern warships in the Atlantic theatre. Somehow Kennedy had survived the hit on the bridge. He knew the gunfire control station had been hit and knocked out, so he ordered his crew to fire on locally to do their best to hit the German ships on their own, and Rawalpindi would go down fighting. The German ship's guns roared with murderously accurate fire. Rawalpindi's little guns were firing back, but wildly and at random. On board, the liner was beginning to burn. Men lay dead around the decks and gun crews had been knocked out. Men were going mad with terror. One gunner was shouting orders at his crew, who lay dead around him. The fires began to burn out of control, and sensing the end, Kennedy had rushed aft with some sailors to try to set some more smoke floats to build a smoke screen to protect his crew as they abandoned ship, but as he did so, a shell burst killed him. With their engines, fire control, and electrical power all knocked out, and more shells coming, the crew knew all they could do was to try to escape in their boats. Cordite and munitions were burning on the upper decks, and some brave crew even picked them up and threw them overboard. One survivor said that Rawalpindi was burning stem to stern like a piece of paper. The men crowded into the lifeboats, but then one upturned on the davits and the occupants were spilled into the sea. They struggled to stay afloat, and the other boats were trying to lower when the end came suddenly and violently. A shell had found the main ammunition storage. It detonated, and Rawalpindi went up in a huge explosion that blew the ship clean in two. It had only been less than an hour, and the valiant little liner had gone down fighting like a warrior against impossible odds. Scharnhorst, for her part, stopped to assist the survivors. The Germans pulled 37 men from the ocean when their own lookout cried out. A British warship had been spotted on the horizon. Rawalpindi's message had not gone unheeded. A floating armada of British battleships, cruisers and destroyers had immediately altered course to hunt the German ships down and destroy them. In something of a panic, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau made steam. They were now in a sticky spot. They'd been caught out and had lost the element of surprise. Rawalpindi had made an accurate positional report, and now the powerful British home fleet could trap and kill them. But then, fortune turned in favour of the Germans. The weather began to turn foul, and then a rain squall obscured them from vision. In the bleak grey sea and the driving rain, the pair escaped British detection and disappeared into the vast ocean. Rawalpindi's action wasn't totally in vain. It had given away the German ships' positions and delayed them sufficiently for a tailing force to arrive. If not for the poor weather, it's likely the German warships would have been hunted down and destroyed early in the war, which would have been a huge blow for the Kriegsmarine, who already lacked sufficient numbers of surface warships. The fact that Rawalpindi had even stood her ground and fought was in itself a morale boost for the British people and the armed forces. 11 of Rawalpindi's men were rescued from the ocean by the British. They were rushed home and marched to Horse Guards Parade, where they were greeted by a crowd of people who called out encouragement and words of gratitude. The Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed Parliament and said of Rawalpindi's crew that their glorious fight against overwhelming odds deserved the respect and honour of the House of Commons and the nation. Years later, a BBC reporter would look back on the conflict and say that it showed people that they could still rely on the Navy and that, even in a ship manned by pensioners and reservists, the Navy was going to fight this war's battles as it had in the past, whatever the outcome, whatever the cost. That reporter's name was Ludovic Kennedy, and his father had been Captain Edward Kennedy, Commander, HMS Rawalpindi. Almost exactly 1 year later, in November 1940, things were looking even bleaker for Britain and the Allies. France had fallen earlier that year along with Norway, Holland and the Low Countries, and then Germany had begun bombing London. The Battle of Britain had been fought and narrowly won, and the risk of a German invasion was lessened, but at sea, the convoys were still being picked apart by the U-boats. The HX convoys were making their way from Halifax, Nova Scotia to Liverpool. They were carrying vital supplies, but they were painfully slow. The ships were only capable of between 9 and 13 knots, which is about 15 miles per hour or 24 kilometers per hour at a maximum. As ever, a wide variety of escorts were put to the task, and on October 28, 1940, the convoy HX-84 set off, some 38 merchant ships in all. They were a juicy target for the Germans, and all they had to fend them off was another converted ocean liner, the brave HMS Jervis Bay. Jervis Bay was one of 5 sister ships built for and operated by the Australian Commonwealth Line just after the First World War. The company was run by the Australian government, who were keen on getting skilled British migrants out to Australia. Thanks to the ravages of war and the nature of technological advancement, their fleet had been fairly ragtag, so they committed to building 5 modern, elegant liners to do the job. They were each named after an Australian bay from a different state. Jervis Bay was named after a spot in New South Wales. She was a fine ship of about 14,000 gross registered tons and 550 feet, or 167 metres in length. No giant by any means, but for her job, she was beautifully designed and more than adept. The Bay class of ships, as they were known, served well leading up to the war, but with the Admiralty sensing a coming conflict, Jervis Bay and 3 of her sisters were requisitioned for combat. Like Rawalpindi, the fact that they were all intended to service far-ranging distances made them ideal for service as armed merchant cruisers. Jervis Bay received the usual conversion and changes. Her peacetime colours were replaced with drab war paint of various greys, and her decks received guns. 7 of those BL 6-inch guns that Rawalpindi had, and the dual-purpose QF 3 inches to act as a rudimentary kind of dual-purpose secondary and anti-air defence. Now that kind of armament was of course pitiful against anything more intimidating than a surface submarine, but it was better than nothing, and it might actually act as a deterrent to keep smaller enemy vessels at bay for fear of receiving a hit. After all, as woefully inadequate as Jervis Bay's First World War era guns might be against larger ships, a single hit could actually doom an enemy submarine. The ship got to work as an escort for the convoys braving the cold, wild Atlantic, and her crew keeping an eye out for enemies. In command was Captain Edward Fagan, a veteran skipper who'd started out as a midshipman on board the legendary HMS Dreadnought. In the First World War, he'd commanded a destroyer as it rushed to the rescue of the crew of a burning vessel, receiving a gallantry medal for the efforts. He spent a little time with the Australian Navy at a college located at, of all places, Jervis Bay in New South Wales before he took command of a series of smaller warships throughout the mid to late 30s. Then finally, in 1940, he was appointed the master of Jervis Bay and given an unenviable task: to protect the convoys with his makeshift warship. He had served in a destroyer, cruisers and minesweepers, but now he'd need to make a warship out of a passenger liner. Late October 1940 saw Jervis Bay become the sole escort ship for a massive convoy of some 37 merchant vessels carrying invaluable supplies for the British mainland. The convoy HX-84 set out from Halifax, Nova Scotia for Liverpool and battled through the freezing, wintry seas, but unbeknownst to all on board, a hunter was stalking them. British radio messages had been intercepted by the German intelligence, and news of a large convoy was tantalising. Roaring through the North Atlantic had been the German heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer. Like Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, she too mounted the quick-firing, smaller caliber 11-inch guns that were adept at picking apart merchant ships. If Admiral Scheer could intercept the convoy, it wasn't impossible the ship could knock out all of the freighters and sink them. There could be no escape. The convoy ships were crawling along at 13 knots maximum, but the Admiral Scheer could cut through the ocean at up to 28 knots. She set a course for the convoy and would attempt an intercept. If Scheer found them, the convoy would be in massive trouble. Late in the afternoon of November 5th, Jervis Bay's lookout spotted a smudge of smoke on the horizon. It had been an uneventful few days out of Halifax, but the sight of smoke was a worrying one. Captain Fagan hoped it might be a friendly ship, and he ordered his signalman to flash a challenge to the stranger. But to his surprise and bemusement, the stranger flashed the challenge right back. There was an exchange back and forth a few times as the challenge was repeated, but not properly answered. Soon the ships were only 15 miles or 24 kilometers apart, but Fagan must have sensed the danger. A final challenge went unanswered, so he ordered his men to rush to action stations and warn the convoy. With a roar, red rockets surged into the sky, a signal for the convoy to scatter. The smudge of smoke had belonged to the funnel of the German heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer, and her captain had played a bluffing game with Jervis Bay as he drew closer and closer, and now all that stood between him and that juicy convoy was a single escort vessel. But unfortunately for the Germans, that escort ship had no plans to escape. Quite the opposite. Fagan and his men would fight. Jervis Bay manoeuvred herself between the Admiral Scheer and the convoy, which was still struggling to break formation and scatter into the late afternoon gloom. The Admiral Scheer's guns trained onto their target, and at about 4:42 PM the first German salvo burst through the air and missed Jervis Bay by only 100 yards or 91 meters. Fagan ordered his men to set a smoke screen by dropping some of those chemical smoke floats over the side, but then, instead of steering for the cover of the smoke, he ordered the helm be swung toward the German ship. Fagan knew that if he could keep the German warship occupied, then the convoy ships had more chance of escape. Darkness would soon come. He would need to sacrifice his own vessel. Jervis Bay would die, but she would go down fighting like a lion. Admiral Scheer blasted away, her 11-inch guns lobbing devastatingly accurate fire at the British ship. And then it happened. The third salvo hit her dead center, knocking out the wireless office and setting fires. That single salvo effectively finished Jervis Bay as a fighting vessel. Her fire control station was knocked out, and so were all of her electrics. The Germans watched as Jervis Bay reeled under the salvo and began to burn. Satisfied that she was through, Admiral Scheer then went to alter course and trained their guns on the merchant ships to cut off the convoy. But then there came a shout. Jervis Bay began to come around and steer straight for the German warship. Fagan ordered full speed ahead. He was going to charge the Admiral Scheer. Jervis Bay's guns fired wildly and inaccurately, hoping to score a hit on the Germans, but it was hopeless. Admiral Scheer had over 4 centimeters or 1.8 inches of deck armor, and Jervis Bay had none. Admiral Scheer's gunners answered Jervis Bay's valiant gesture with devastating gunfire. The German shell hits began to rake her from stem to stern, and every single one did incredible damage. Then one hit the bridge. It set the command center on fire, and Fagan had lost an arm. But in spite of the physical pain and the destruction of his ship underfoot, the captain knew he had to battle on to buy the convoy more time. It was a completely one-sided battle. Hit after hit caused carnage on Jervis Bay. One 6-inch gun was blown right off the bow. Fires spread completely unchecked, and men jumped overboard for fear of burning or out of panic. After 20 minutes, Jervis Bay had been reduced to a flaming wreck. She'd put up a gallant fight, but it was a hopeless one. Captain Fagan had been killed by a shell hit, and his vessel was finished. Jervis Bay slipped beneath the waves, at last leaving a plume of smoke and an oil slick on the surface. But they'd done their task. Admiral Scheer was now badly delayed in attacking the convoy because they'd been caught up in the gun duel with the escort ship. She made full speed for the remaining vessels, which had successfully scattered, and began to overtake them. Inevitably, she caught up. SS Maid was sunk, then the Trewellard, Kenbane Head, Beaverford, then the SS Fresno City, but that was it. 37 merchant ships had been in the convoy HX-84, but Admiral Scheer was only able to sink 5 of them. The time spent engaging Jervis Bay had enabled the vulnerable freighters enough time to scatter and disappear into the early evening's darkness. At last, with the sun down, they made good their escape, and the Admiral Scheer broke off the chase, frustrated at the wasted opportunity. Jervis Bay had put up a hell of a fight. It was extremely fortunate they'd been intercepted by the Admiral Scheer so close to the evening, but then that was no coincidence either. The German ship had been rushing to intercept the convoy hours earlier when they stumbled into a single vessel, the Mopan, which had been acting as a screen ahead of the main body of the convoy. Scheer ordered the Mopan be abandoned and forbade them from transmitting a distress call. The British crew complied, but they took their sweet time evacuating the ship, buying the convoy more time as darkness approached. Admiral Scheer then engaged the Mopan to sink it quickly and move on to the convoy, but for some reason the ship proved strangely reluctant to sink. It chewed up an hour and a half of the German warship's time, and it meant that when they finally spotted Jervis Bay and the convoy, they had precious little time to do any actual damage. If Jervis Bay had surrendered or turned to run, the convoy could have been doomed, but instead Fagan and his men stood their ground and rushed the German ship. It was a tragic sacrifice, but it hadn't been in vain. Their comrades and mates had got away, and 80% of the convoy survived the ordeal. Of the action, Vice Admiral Charles Kennedy Purvis said, "Now, that is a tremendous decision to take when you are faced with overwhelming odds, but I know that in Captain Fagan's case there were no second thoughts." Jervis Bay was lost with her skipper and 190 of her crew, but fortunately 68 men were later fished out of the ocean alive by a Swedish ship. That's coincidentally almost 1 man for every merchant ship that the Jervis Bay had sacrificed herself trying to protect. The news again bucked up the British public, who now endured German bombing by night, which set the capital ablaze. Fagan, Jervis Bay and her men had shown that sacrifice and courage in the face of impossible odds could achieve great things. It went hand in hand with the Blitz spirit. Hitler had hoped that nighttime bombing of London would break the British spirit and see them sue for peace, but instead, the British public got on with their lives with a cheerful kind of indifference. For his part, Captain Fagan was posthumously awarded the highest British military honour, the Victoria Cross, and his men were also honoured with memorials across Britain, Canada, and Bermuda. Fagan's poignant Victoria Cross citation summed it all up well. It said, "For valour in challenging hopeless odds and giving his life to save the many ships it was his duty to protect, crippled in flames, unable to reply for nearly an hour, the Jervis Bay held the Germans' fire. So she went down, but of the merchantmen, all but 4 or 5 were saved.